Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted. And here we have another educational video, this time answering the age-old question, hi Curse Deck Builder, how many mana rocks in my deck please? So I don't want to bury the lead here, I'm going to tell you what my opinion is right away, and then the rest of the video will be working backwards to figure out how I got there and maybe answering a few questions you have along the way. And the thesis of this video, and my whole idea, is that mana rocks are holdovers from an earlier time in Commander, where power level of cards was closely tied to mana cost. And that 2-cost mana rocks are only really good for mana fixing, and even then, I think they are overused and overplayed. I know this might be like kind of a strong opinion. There's been I would say over a long time, kind of this falling out of love with mana rocks. It used to be we would run as many 3 mana rocks, and then we agreed collectively. We all met together. I started hearing these videos that people were like, 3 mana mana rocks aren't good, which I was like, yes, that's true. And then the kind of lens fell onto 2 mana rocks, and people were like, well, 2 mana rocks are still good, right? And so this video and everything going forward, I'm trying to rebut that. I'm trying to say, no, 2 mana rocks are actually somehow worse than 3 mana rocks, and let's find out why I think that. Start with some definitions. What is a mana rock? Well, a mana rock, if you think like Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, has a few kind of qualities to it that are just inherent that we understand. So it's an artifact that taps for mana, and it is not an artifact that filters mana. If you're thinking any of those lens cards, any of those cards that will take any color and put it into any other color, those aren't mana rocks, because they do not produce mana, they just change mana. It's not an artifact that ramps. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean an artifact that comes into play and puts a land into play, or an artifact that is sacrificed to put a land into play. There's a few of them, they're very rare, but they're not exactly mana rocks, because they tend to only be able to do their thing once, and mana rocks are kind of defined by their repeatability, which is something that should be on this list, but it's not. Mana rocks can be mana with a restriction, such as mana that is only be able to be used with instants of sorceries, or mana that's only being able to be used on creatures. Those are still mana rocks. If they follow everything else, they're still considered mana rocks, but are usually considered to be less useful mana rocks. Mana rocks can require a color. Though almost universally mana rocks are colorless, that's not always the case. There are some colored mana rocks, and later in this video, I'm going to argue that those are the better ones, but we'll get there. And finally, mana rocks can create colored or colorless mana. It's actually not a key point, because Arcane Signet creates any colored mana, whereas Soul Ring creates colorless mana. They're both considered mana rocks. There's no difference there. There's no problem there. So what is the purpose of a mana rock? Well, I find that mana rocks do 4 things. 1, they give access to all of your colors. We call this mana fixing, or to fix your mana. So if you're in 3 or 4 colors, using something like a Signet from the original Ravnica set, which will give you one, like a Dimir Signet is a blue and a black for a colorless, will give you more colors than you might have at the moment, which enables you to play your spells. The other purpose, and I would say is a very strong purpose, is to ramp to key mana amounts. So for example, if you are playing a 4 mana commander, and this will come up again later, you can use a mana rock at 2 mana on your second turn to try to guarantee on your third turn you have the 4 mana needed to play your commander. Likewise, if you are for some reason playing a deck that only runs 3 mana spells, having something like a mana dork on the first turn or a mana rock on the first turn, which doesn't work, like Soul Ring, I guess, allows you to ramp to that key amount of 3 and enable the rest of your deck. Another thing that mana rocks can do is they can fill out a curve and use mana efficiently. This is going to be a bit contentious, but I really do believe that games are won by using all of your mana every turn, and that mana rocks are useful for that. The contentious part is, I think, not very useful for that, but I still think it's worth saying that if you're going to play a tap land turn 1 and then turn 2, a mana rock is still a reasonable play that allows you to drop, use your mana efficiently. This isn't even including the possibility of using your mana on a mana rock, tapping that mana rock and playing something else. We're all familiar with the player who goes turn 1 land, Soul Ring into Arcane Signet into I don't know, something else, right? And that's seen as like a really, really powerful turn one and a very, very strong play, but it is more about the amount of mana that is efficiently being used and not necessarily, you know, the fact that they just had all of these cards. Like, for example, if I go Soul Ring into Arcane Signet, pass, and then turn 2 comes and I don't play anything, well, that really powerful turn 1 kind of is meaningless because all of a sudden I'm not using that mana efficiently. So Mana Rocks can help with that. And finally, Mana Rocks can be combo pieces, and I think this is the most valid version of Mana Rocks. Dramatic Reversal, if you're not familiar, is a 2-mana blue card that untaps all of your artifacts, and if you put this on like something like Scepter, which allows you to repeatedly do this, you can use Mana Rocks to get to, you know, infinite mana or a tremendous amount of mana. Or you can use them alongside other untap abilities, right? This is a way to use artifacts really effectively for a combo. On the other hand, what is the cost of running a Mana Rock? Well, first and foremost, and very simply, is it takes up a card slot. We only have 100 cards, and by definition, we can't really go over or under. Only by playing more commanders can we kind of shave down, you know, 1 commander, you have a 99 card deck, 2 commanders, you have a 98, what is it, like 2 commanders and a companion, you're at 97. I'm sure someday we'll break 96, but with that in mind, we only have so many cards we get to play, and a Mana Rock taking one of those slots is a real cost. Mana Rocks are only really useful when you're neutral with your opponents. If you've watched my videos, I occasionally talk about the concept of the 4 quadrants of allowing us to judge a card's usefulness, let's say. There is the quadrant of when you're behind, when you're neutral, when you're ahead, and when your commander is out. And the way I generally look at it is this is a good way of figuring out if a card is win more, because if it's only good when you're ahead, and if it's only good when your commander's out, it's probably a win more card. But this is also useful for kind of just judging when a card is good. And the thing with Mana Rocks is there's only really one zone that it's particularly good, and that's when you're neutral. So when you are behind, you really do not want to be drawing Mana Rocks because that is probably getting in the way of you being able to cast spells and impact the game, such as a board clear, such as removal. Sure, we might argue that if you're behind on lands, Mana Rocks can help you get ahead, but I would say almost universally you would have preferred another land over the Mana Rock, because perhaps you had you have Day of Judgment in hand and 3 mana. You'd rather have drawn a Plains so you can play Day of Judgment, rather than a Mana Rock with the idea that on your next turn you can untap and cast Day of Judgment, right? It's also pretty bad when you are ahead. When you are winning the game and you top deck Mana Rock, sure, you get to play it because you're probably in a situation where you can, not commit more to the board or just funnel your victory forward. But you probably would have rathered it being a removal spell, an interaction spell, a counter spell probably, or just another threat or something like that to enable you to push your victory forward instead of building up to a future that might not exist because you could probably win next turn, right? You'd prefer anything else. So with that in mind, Mana Rocks are only really, really good in that neutral zone. Specifically also, they're particularly bad late game. Outside of very specific scenarios, and I'm imagining like mass land destruction and you have a few lands back, a board clear and you're trying to get back to your commander mana, these situations can be neutral situations at the table, but you still probably would rather something else than a Mana Rock. Mana Rocks are just really, really good in your opening hand, and they just kind of fall off every subsequent turn, to the point that they just become dead draws at a certain point. And the other cost of a Mana Rock, and this is just kind of like a deck building idea and curve, is that it can conflict with other cards of the same mana cost. I forgot to write same there, pretend it's there. So what I mean by that is that if you have a bunch of 2 mana cards, let's say, that you want to cast, you might have to choose between them. Like if you have to choose between holding up like Counterspell, Go for the Throat, or casting out Dread Magistrate, a 2 Mana Rock like Arcane Signet, especially on turn 2, will kind of be a problem between those things. And you might say, well, Cursed, just play the Mana Rock, the Counterspell or the removal spell doesn't get worse as the game progresses, so you're kind of building forward. And I get that, but it's not entirely true, right? it is a situation where, you know, one of your opponent plays, I don't know, Esper Sentinel, Ragavan, or things like this really, really early, and you want to get rid of it, or one of your opponents is liable to drop their commander very, very soon, and you want to have Counterspell ready, you do have to make a decision, right? Even more so, once again, arguments such as Drannith Magistrate, Dark Confidant, Thalia, cards that are in the 2 mana slot that are just really, really strong that you want out as soon as possible. Taking a turn off to play the Mana Rock sucks. Likewise, taking a turn off of your Mana Rock so that on turn 3 you play a Mana Rock also sucks. So this kind of tension can exist. Now I know what you're saying, this tension can be alleviated with card selection, and this is very, very true. So if you're building a deck that runs a bunch of 1 mana spells more than anything else, things like Arcane Signet aren't as bad, because it's turn 2, you play Arcane Signet, and then you hold up Lightning Bolt, for example, or Dismember, or Swords to Plowshares, and all of a sudden you're not too far behind. However, we don't always have that luxury, and we should keep that in mind. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at the idea that Mana Rocks are artifacts of the past. Pun completely intended. Not originally, but now very much so intended. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, back when Commander was just becoming a format, people were making decks, Mana Rocks were way more powerful then than they are now. However, with how we build decks and we learn from each other building decks, Mana Rocks have always kind of stayed on the radar, despite the things that made them necessary slowly fading away. And so why do we still play Mana Rocks and talk about them? Well, it's kind of tradition. It's just kind of seen as a cornerstone of Commander. And the things that made that good no longer exist. And what was that? What are those things? What was that? And what are the things that have changed to make Mana Rocks less powerful? Well, I've got 5 points here that we're going to go through. First one is 2 mana cards used to be weaker, then mana fixing used to be worse, aggro wasn't a real option, it was much harder back at the time to punish artifacts, and the strongest cards are no longer 6+ mana. So let's go through those. 2 mana cards used to be weaker. Mana Rocks used to have less competition in the 2-drop slot. This is just kind of a fact, because back in the day, a lot of cards just didn't have the same power, especially in terms of Commander. We used cards that were strong, yes, but cards that were still tuned to a 1-on-1 format. And therefore, we didn't have a lot of the exponentially growing cards that get better with extra opponents, or cards that are tuned to the power level that Commander requires. Nowadays, every theme has like an excellent 2-drop that's worth playing over a Mana Rock on turn 2. So looking at this, we've got like Zulaport Cutthroat, which is great for Aristocrats, Impact Tremors, that's good for aggro, Blink, those kind of strategies, Burn, SRAM for enchantment artifact decks, SRAM Senior Edificer, sorry, forgot their position, Sithis for enchantments, Creeping Bloodsucker for life gain, life steal, that kind of stuff, Fauna Shaman for Reanimator, you know, even then like Dredge and Graveyard decks. These are just some examples, right? Like, these are all really, really good cards that you would probably play over a Mana Rock. This includes artifacts and ramp decks as well, even. When you think of ramp decks, especially like Mana Dorks, now Mana Dorks are so strong that they'll come in, you know, tapping for 1 mana, but later in the game will tap for more mana. Either they'll grow in power, or they'll another clause will open it up, and later in the game they tap for 4, 5, 6 mana, which a Mana Rock is unable to do. Likewise, even those artifact decks have better mana reduction abilities, such as cards that reduce the mana cost on all artifacts, like a Medallion on a creature, or they'll just have better cards in that slot. And this isn't even mentioning universally good 2 mana cards, such as Drannith Magistrate, Fairy Mastermind, Dauthi Voidwalker. I could go on. You know the list of cards I like. So all of these cards just compete in that 2 mana slot where Mana Rocks used to just rule supreme. Mana fixing used to be worse. This is a really big one, I think, and potentially the biggest one at all. It's just that now we have a larger variety of lands at all budget levels. Like, think of all the different cycles of lands that have been introduced since Commander was first thought up as an idea, and we just have so many options. Like, not even having things like Triomes or Surveil lands or Verges, like these are cards that have either just been printed or have quite a price tag to them. But even like, you know, we've got the Kaldheim Snowlands, we've got the Dominaria tap lands, which is the next point, is that there is an increase of non-basics with basic land type, increasing the value of land searching ramp, right? Because mana rocks that could tap for, let's say, 2 colors like a Signet were not as good as playing like Farseek and grabbing like Bayou, because Bayou and Shock lands were like the only options at the time. But now, as mentioned before, we have like common cards and or like uncommon cards as well that have both land types attached to them, giving us even better things to search. That's not even including, of course, with things like the Surveil lands, which are just insanely powerful, or the Triomes that also have that. All of this just increasing the power of our land searching ramp over something like a mana rock. Also, treasure tokens are extremely accessible and powerful. When it comes to mana fixing, treasure tokens are king. They often will get you the mana you need to continue going at such a small cost that it doesn't even matter. From creatures that attack and deal damage to create treasures, or treasures that trigger off of your opponents doing things, or just like upkeep treasures. Like the cost of a treasure token is so little, and it'll just buy you the time to draw another land, get another way to search, fetch, ramp that will fix your mana, instead of just like, having to commit to a mana rock for the rest of the game. Another really big one is that aggro wasn't a real option. Back in the day, you used to be able to just slam mana rocks, and I'm gonna even suggest you could slam mana rocks into other mana rocks, into ramp, and just take your time. I know some people are fond of that kind of gameplay and are nostalgic for it. And a big thing that made that possible is that just aggro wasn't a part of Commander. Even I think a few years ago, we were still talking about aggro not being a strategy in Commander, and I just don't think that's true anymore. Back in the day, 40 life used to be a much bigger buffer than it is now, but power creep, and I think that's kind of the big theme of this section, is that power creep has really made that not the case, right? It is easy for players to get very big creatures very, very quickly, especially if they're themed into it, and then sometimes even if they're not, right? Like an elf deck that might not be an aggro deck can still build really, really big elves really, really quickly, like almost accidentally, right? With anthem effects and other such things and overrun effects. But things that are meant to be aggro can chunk out your life, and 40 life just doesn't matter. Creatures are way more threatening than they used to be. Now, I'm going to be very, very specific in this first point that I know these are really, really powerful cards, but I think they're worth considering. Cards like Psychic Frog, Ragavan, Orcish Bowmasters, and Esper Sentinel. Like, yes, they're not all giant, like, they're different from what I just said. They don't chunk your life out, but they're really, really threatening cards that you need to either play yourself at higher levels, or you need to play around. And so not only like are people playing more creatures, they're playing really, really good creatures. I think Ragavan is a particularly important one, and we'll get back to that in a second. Things that attach to creatures are more threatening than they used to be. By that I mean equipment or aura cards, because just that bar has just increased. Like equipment, back in the day, GTA is still like a really, really strong card, but we've got new sword cycles. We've got new, like, more aggressive abilities to grow your creatures over time, or give them better evasion, or Shadow Spear and things like that. Like creatures that were already getting stronger now can get even more stronger, getting evasion and starting like getting hits in. Auras especially, I think, have grown in power just so much, because for the longest time, and this is still kind of true, auras are one of the worst card types, because if you destroy the creature, they fall off. But now, to make up for them, we've got bestow auras, we've got like really powerful, really low mana auras that do a lot of things, and things that just make, once again, early creatures much more threatening. The ability to attack or block is way more valuable. Going back to Ragavan, when one of your opponents plays a Ragavan or a similar type of card that triggers on attack or on combat damage, the ability to have a blocker is way more valuable. Because if you're the player just playing mana rocks, you're going to be attacked with that Ragavan every turn, and your opponent is going to be ramping for free while you hang out and just be like a punching bag, right? But that's not even including things like Monarch, like getting the monarchy or initiative and going through the dungeon, the Undercity, right? These things are really, really important aspects of the game that we need to be aware of. And I know to an extent, those two things don't carry the same kind of weight. Like, I've yet to meet someone who doesn't like the monarchy, and I've yet to meet a lot of people who like the Undercity and initiative, but we can't ignore that they're parts of our formats now, and by not playing early creatures or not playing around them, not only are you not, getting involved in these mechanics, your aggro opponents are getting to reap the benefits. And as you might know, the aggro player that keeps the monarchy tends to win the game. So something to be considering. Finally, just summing this all up, the cost of taking off an early turn and to not develop your board or hold up removal to deal with these cards, like, the cost is so much higher. Taking that example I gave earlier about playing Arcane Signet instead of holding up Counterspell or Go for the Throat, to an extent, this is the same argument, right? You have to kind of figure out the opportunity cost for taking a turn off early on when everyone is building up their boards and their game plans so quickly. It's much easier to punish artifacts now. This is maybe not the biggest point, but I think it's worth considering. Artifact removal is much more valuable now because, like, artifact decks are a lot more common, and the need to be able to take out, something like one of the altars. I'm thinking Phyrexian Altar, I'm thinking Ashnod's Altar, I'm thinking about the one that mills people, stuff like key artifacts that could even be creatures. Like, the ability to stop them from doing what they are doing is much more important now. Also, many powerful modular spells have shatter effects stapled on. Nowadays, there's so many cards that just incidentally shatter. Like, there's so many. And most of those cards, are already good. I remember back when they used to start printing like 3-mana red creatures that would either destroy an artifact or like have riot or like have create a treasure token. I think that's one from D&D. And those were good then, right? Those were cards that just were really, really strong at the time. And we've power creeped since then. We have even more cards that just incidentally destroy artifacts. I think of that fungus, the 3/2 fungus that's modular that can be sacrificed. I think exile a card from a graveyard, destroy enchantment or artifact, right? And that's just there. Like, it's a 3/2 beater. I think it also has proliferate, but like, just that line that says here, hey, destroy target artifact, makes it so accessible for your opponent to see, like, your mana's bad or you haven't been drawing lands, and see how powerful it is just to destroy your mana rock is just so easy now. They don't even need to think about it. It's just built in, and that makes that really, really scary. And finally, ironically, cards that are meant to punish treasure tokens also punish mana rocks. Like, we got to the point that treasure tokens were so good that commander deck after commander deck, we would see like a card that's meant to kind of mess up treasure tokens, but that would often also destroy or deal with mana rocks. I'm thinking of the ones that like ping you or grow the creature for how many artifacts you play, the ones that punish your opponents for tapping artifacts, things like that also hit mana rocks. And so you are being hated on by the cards that are meant for stronger decks. I don't know if you've ever been at I'm trying to think, at like a modern event or any 60 card format where you're like the second most powerful artifact deck. I don't know if you know that feeling where you're playing like a rogue deck or a fun deck that people don't really know and you're just there to have fun. But everyone in the store is like there for the really powerful artifact player. So they all have Stony Silences. They all have like Hurkyl's Recalls and things like that. And there you are just trying to hang out, playing a fun artifacts deck, and you're getting stomped into the ground coincidentally almost. And so that's how I feel about mana rocks. Like, you're getting broken by cards that are meant to deal with stronger strategies, and that just sucks. This last one's kind of nebulous, but I still want to put it out there, and the strongest cards are no longer 6+ mana. This is kind of like a holdover from what we used to call battle cruiser magic, right? That's like everyone would just ramp into 6, 7, 8 mana, slam these giant creatures with huge power and toughness, and often not very good abilities, and then just take turns punching each other in the face. It's fun, I guess, but it's not really a thing anymore. Though higher mana cards have equally increased in power, 3 and 4 cost cards have exponentially increased in power. Like examples, Smothering Tide, the One Ring, Braids, Arisen Nightmare, Evolutionary Witness, Kodama of the West Tree, the Reaver Cleaver. That's not even including all of the creatures that are like 2 mana, all of these kind of really good removal or interaction spells. That's not even including the cards that are built for Commander, like, the Archaeomancer's map, and other things that just take advantage of having a bunch of opponents, and therefore are what we would consider, good cards to begin with, but are then just scaled even further by the number of opponents you have. Like, I know this is silly, but like Burglar Rat? Burglar Rat is a 2 mana card that discards 3 cards, and that's just insane. We just did not have that kind of power back in the day, and even when we had things close to it, they just weren't very good. So we no longer are playing a game where we need to ramp up to the highest mana cost cards in order to do anything. Like, we just, every step of the way, we've got better cards, so why are we ramping? Why aren't we playing these cards? I think even there's an argument that our 6+ mana cards are also way better now than they used to be. I don't even think that's an argument. There's like a few exceptions. I think of Elishnorn and like maybe Sheoldred and Vorinclex from the first one. Jin Cataxias, sure. Poor Orobraska. But like outside of those kind of cards and like Avacyn from back in the day, we've got Archons, we've got like much better reanimator targets, we've got creatures that come in ETB and draw, 3 or more cards. Do you remember that like Black Demons used to have downsides? They're all just upsides now. Like the sheer power level of even the 6+ mana cards is just completely changed. And so even if we could say, hey, wouldn't it be great to ramp into like Archon of Cruelty? Like, we don't even need to. The cards before that are just as strong. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. I do want to address which mana rocks are worth running, because there's definitely some that are. The first group are what I'm going to call mana positive rocks, and there's a few more than these, but I think they're still, these two will be the nice poster children for them. And these are mana rocks that tap for more mana than they cost. Of course, Sol Ring here is the poster child of this kind of effect, but something like Lotus Petal and a number of other more CDH-tuned mana rocks, or what we call fast mana, all kind of fall into this section. It's part of the reason that Sol Ring will never go away, is that it's just, one, the poster child of the format, but two, it's a good card. It is such a powerful mana rock to the point that I think it's the exception to most of the things I said before, not just because of the mana it produces, but at that 1 mana cost. So with that in mind, even if you aren't going into the CDH aspect of this, you can look at Sol Ring and understand why this is worth running. After that, I would say the 2 or more mana rocks. And these are mana rocks that will generate 2 or more mana. These, I think, are much better, because even though they still fall into a lot of the problems, they alleviate them at the same time. One, they're not all at 2 mana, and that kind of like takes a bit of the pressure off of the 2 mana slot, which a lot of decks just have a lot of really good cards in. And though something like Worn Power Stone, sure, does go into the 3 mana slot, which is another very important slot, it's still like, you'd run one of these instead of 4 2 mana rocks, so like it's way different, and so it's easier to kind of budget for. And that's not even including things like Gilded Lotus and Dreamstone Hedron, where they're like, 5 or 6 mana cards that oftentimes you're not going to have a lot of 5 or 6 mana cards there. And the mana that these cards produce is relevant, right? It's not putting you 1 turn ahead. It's putting you several turns ahead. They work better with untappers such as Voltaic Key, or Voltaic Key, I think it's pronounced, or other things that will allow you to reuse your artifacts. Instead of, being mana neutral, you are generating way more mana. And therefore, I like these cards way more. Especially looking at Gilded Lotus and other such cards, it's also important to value that these cards tend to be better at mana fixing because they don't generate 1 mana at a time. The Signets are kind of the exception there, but even then now, like, a lot of cards are 2 pips of the same color. I'm thinking like Dothy Voidwalker and things like that, that the Signets have gotten a little weaker, whereas something like Gilded Lotus, or like, there's that Sauron card that makes any 2 out of blue, black, and red, or a number of other cards, I think there's one with Niv Mizzet on it, that just help you kind of tap for extra colors later in the game and in a more valuable way. And I really like that. Obviously, something also like Dreamstone Hedron is really good because that sack effect that Mind Stone, and we'll get back to Mind Stone effect, is really, really good once you're later in the game. This is, of course, even including my personal favorite, Thran Dynamo, which is 4 mana to instantly get 3 mana, and that's just really, really good. Already, this is better than most 4 mana ramp spells, because those will put 2 lands into play, but it gives you the mana immediately. Thran Dynamo is crazy. I love Thran Dynamo. This is the kind of mana rocks that I want to run. There's also themed mana rocks that I think are still generally worth playing, and these are mana rocks that just have a really strong ability for a themed deck. Here I'm looking at things like Cursed Mirror and Machine God's Effigy, which are kind of the same thing as they come in as being a copy of something. Obviously Cursed Mirror is for 1 turn, but Machine God's Effigy is permanently, and that's really, really cool. Crowded Crypt is great for zombie decks. There are others. I've got 2 more here. Hourglass of the Lost is a really cool kind of reanimation card attached to a mana rock. Jade Orb of Dragonkind is fine. Green doesn't really use mana rocks, but I did find this one. There's way others, and not all of them are also like generating colored mana, but things that make like at 3 mana and beyond, they tend to do real things for your strategy. Either making, like counting the number of instants and sorceries you're casting and doing something with that, or allowing creatures to come in with extra effects or things like that. That can make them much more valuable. Especially looking back at Cursed Mirror and Machine God's Effigy, blue and red both having an either, a 1-turn clone like Kiki Jiki style, or a permanent copy of one of your cards is really, really cool and can be really powerful in a deck like this. So I like these kind of themed mana rocks quite a bit. I do not like these ones. Mind Stone and Thought Vessel are not good cards, and I really, really wish no one would ever play them. Mind Stone is a card that is 3 mana to draw a card, and if you really, really want that, you should play Commander Sphere. And please don't play Commander Sphere. I would rather you just do anything else. I understand Mind Stone's there, in a pinch. Dog food can do in a pinch, but you're still eating dog food, so I really don't want you to play Mind Stone. And Thought Vessel, if you've not heard enough of people talking about the problem with the, is it Darksteel Citadel? Reliquary Tower. Reliquary Tower is not a good card almost 90% of the time. Why would you want to pay mana for that effect? And I understand certain decks can hit 8-9 cards in hand regularly in the mid game. If you can't do that, and even if you can't do that, right? Because if you have 8-9 cards in hand, you can still just discard. If you're getting like 15-20 cards, maybe it's worth running Thought Vessel. And you and I both know you aren't playing that deck. If you see me play Necropotence, draw 30 cards, and then happily discard to 7, you should not play Thought Vessel. That's my opinion for sure. So please don't play these utility. They're just bad. So what's our conclusion? Our conclusion is that running 1 to 2 mana rocks is acceptable for mana fixing in an average game of Commander. That's really it. That's really the height of mana rocks. And I really don't want you to play those 2 to begin with, but if those 2 are 1 Soul Ring, 1 Arcane Signet, oh, I said 2 mana rocks, sorry. So 1 Arcane Signet and then 1 on-color Talisman, you'll be fine. But let's get to the real conclusion. And the real conclusion is if you're interested in these kind of effects, you should be running Green Ramp instead or running Treasures instead. These are your options for mana fixing and for ramp that are just way, way better. Green Ramp is just so good at doing everything that I said that mana rocks were good at while having so many better perks. Green Ramp starts at 1 mana, whether it be Elvish Mystic, Utopia Sprawl. This 1 mana, being able to start ramping immediately is way, way more valuable. Not even including things like Birds of Paradise that can fix your color, or Deathrite Shaman that fixes your color and is almost like a Planeswalker. And on the other hand, when it comes to making more mana, cards like Sky Shroud Claim, these 4 mana, 5 mana, and further cards ramp way more efficiently, give you way more lands, and work with things like Landfall and otherwise. You might say, well, Curse, you just said that Thran Dynamo is better than cards like Sky Shroud Claim. It's true, but Sky Shroud Claim and its contemporaries are all fixing your mana and don't get destroyed by artifact hate. So there is a real benefit to these green ramp cards. That's not even including the ability that we have to run creatures that ramp us and are just good creatures to play. Overlord of the Hauntwoods is an insane creature, and it just passively generates you, free ramp mana that taps for every color. Like, it's just insane the power level that green can give you in the same ways. I didn't even include cards like Wood Elves and the like that just are a creature and put a land into play. And if you watch my previous video on how important the number of lands you play is, you know exactly what I mean at the power level of these kind of cards. Then we go into Treasure. And Treasure has a few more colors. Obviously, it's not connected necessarily with green, but green, red, black have a lot of treasure cards. Blue sometimes has a few treasure cards. White has a few catch-up treasure cards. A lot of the cards I'm going to show here are red. They just happen to be red, but there's a lot of options. And that, what I just said, is like the key here. There's a lot of options. Like, look at these cards, these treasure cards that are all loot or rummage effects. These are rummage effects, right? You discard card, draw cards, and incidentally get treasure tokens to help you pay for your next spell or fix your mana. But like, you don't want to play these? Cool, let's play a bunch of artifacts that make our creatures into better attackers and in a way mana rocks, because now they're generating mana. Sticky Fingers is a card I really like, just incredibly powerful, of giving you menace, treasure tokens, and getting a card back when your creature dies. Beamtown Beatstick, likewise, same kind of thing, except for it stays on the battlefield. Not even including Diamond Pickaxe, that also, whenever it's on attack, it's not even on combat damage. Like, these cards are all so good that you can take your early creatures and just start benefiting from them, so you don't even need to start running those ones before. But what if you don't want to attack with the creatures? Well, we even have cards that are like Charming Scant. Actually, then Theron Bandit still needs to attack. I'm wrong about that, but you don't want a secondary card. We've got cards that generate treasure tokens or on attack or ETB as well. A lot of these aren't very good creatures, and there's not a lot of them there. Obviously, exceptions being things like Ragavan and such, but are still really worthwhile of noting that you can just have creatures that by themselves at low mana costs generate treasure tokens. But what if you want even more than that? What if you want cards that are either card advantage or just really strong cards that treasure tokens are just stapled to? I know my picture over here, let's see, over here, is covering Inspired Tinkering, so I'll read that one, where it's a 5 mana, exile top 3 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may cast them, so you impulse draw 3, and then create 3 treasure tokens. Like, that is so much extremely strong text in one card. Reign of Riches, of course, you get 2 treasure tokens, and now your treasure spells cascade. That's more for a, intentional treasure deck, but it's still there. Black Market Connections will get you a treasure every turn for 1 life, unless you're a coward. And like, these cards are so strong, and they're just there incidentally making you treasure, right? The difference between this and like mana rocks, it's just night and day. That's not even including the elephant in the room of Smothering Tide, which you always get to run if you want your friends to hate you. And if you're like me, you absolutely want your friends to hate you. So as we're closing up, a good time to go over but cursed, what about? To answer some questions you might have. What about artifact-themed decks? Though I covered them here and there, I think mana rocks definitely do a lot better in artifact-themed decks. Partially, I'd have to say which theme, right? Because if you're doing something like with Mirror, you get to play a bunch of mana dorks. If you're not, maybe those mana rocks are better. If you're using Scepter, Dramatic Reversal Scepter combo, obviously they get better from that. But also the question becomes, are you playing like Artifact Aristocrats? Because then I really like the mana rocks because they do their job and they're sacrificed later. But then I just ask, why aren't you playing treasure tokens? Like, you're playing those mana rocks in addition to treasure tokens at that point, which just do the job better. You might ask, what about 4 mana commanders? I said this earlier on the idea of being able to ramp into your 4 mana commander incredibly quickly. And I think there is some merit to this line of thinking, but there are some pitfalls as well, because I think it really depends on your commander. Something like Miss Bumbleflower, which I've recently fallen in love with, gets to play mana dorks at 1 mana because she's in green, so I don't want mana rocks. Likewise, if I look at something like Queen Marchesa, an old favorite of mine, I think to myself of playing a Talisman turn 2 and then turn 3 playing Queen Marchesa, getting Monarchy, hasting. But now that's a lot harder because there's a lot of cards I want to cast on the way there. On turn 2, I want to cast an attacker. I want to cast a human if it's a human Marchesa deck. I want to cast a legendary creature if it's legendary, or reanimate, etc., etc. I've got better things to do. And that's not even including turn 3 where I could play Phyrexian Arena, I can play Necropotence, I can play a number of really powerful cards. But both of those go away if I'm going turn 2 ramp into Queen Marchesa, right? The opportunity cost has gone from being getting Marchesa early to losing out on a really powerful 2-drop and a really powerful 3-drop. So to me, the answer has become, even with 4-mana commanders, I'd really rather not play a 2-mana mana rock, but it's closer. And I'd love to hear what people think about that one. Next is, what about thief decks? By that, I mean decks that steal your opponent's cards, exile them, allow you to cast them. These are often blue-black, though recently I think we had a Sultai one as well. So here's the thing. Some cards allow you to pay with any mana, right? That they'll say, take a card from your opponent's deck or exile their top card, you may cast this spell using any color of mana. Those cards don't need mana rocks in that way. However, a lot of the older kinds and some of the really good ones like Praetor's Grasp and the like do not have this ability on it. So I would say if you're playing a thief deck that tends to run a lot more of these not mana filtering cards, then mana rocks get way better, especially specifically because they tend to be blue-black. If you're playing like a Sultai version, you have the means of playing Mana Dorks, and then you can go back to the earlier slide and say, hey, you should just run Green Ramp instead. But if you're in blue-black and you need those other colors, that's a pretty good exception to be running like more mana rocks than just Arcane Signet, Felwar. You get to play Felwar Stone and things like that. What about medallions? This is the last one I'll touch on because medallions are not mana rocks. And it's important to kind of consider that they don't do the same thing, right? Medallions belong in decks that tend to cast multiple spells in each turn and tend to be one color. We just did a black deck that Jet Medallion is very strong in because it is a deck that's going to cast multiple black spells every turn and it's mono black. The further away we go from those two things, where multiple spells a turn and one color, the worse the medallions get. So though I can advocate for the medallions, I'm not really going to bring them up in this video because I think they're functionally different things. So I hope this video has answered your questions. I really enjoyed making it. I'm not saying necessarily you should just never run mana rocks. That's not really the point of this. I just want to explain where I'm coming from and why I build with less mana rocks now. But if you are on a really, really low power deck and you've only found like 32 lands in your entire collection, there are exceptions to the rule and you have my blessing. You will just hear opinions from me whenever you bust it out. This video was made by a question that one of my patrons asked on my Discord, and I hope you guys, when you think of these kind of questions, you send them to me, whether it be in the comments below, or if you want to join me on Patreon, get access to the Discord and send me those questions in person. I don't mind. I love answering questions and I love this kind of educational content, and I hope you do too. Thank you, subscribe, do all that stuff. Good luck, happy deck building. I used to really like the idea